Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Álvaro Santos. I'm on the faculty at Georgetown Law, and I'm the director of the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas, Carola. Welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to our conference on the future of NAFTA and North American economic integration. We have a great program ahead of us with 3 panels and a keynote. It's an honor to have such a superb list of speakers. We're very much looking forward to our discussions. I would now like to take a few minutes to describe the ideas behind the conference and what we hope to accomplish today. These are testing times for globalization. The economic model that underpinned the liberal globalization in the last 3 decades and the institutions that sustain it have been increasingly under attack in Europe and in the United States. 2 markers of this backlash are Brexit and the 2016 US presidential election won by Donald Trump, running on a clear opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership and to trade more generally. A position, we should remember, shared by the 2 Democratic presidential candidates, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, in the run to the election. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, introduced 23 years ago, encapsulated the optimism in liberal globalization and served as example for subsequent preferential trade agreements. As you well know, NAFTA has come under attack by the US government, which has called for its renegotiation and even withdrawal. In this conference, we want to focus on NAFTA because of its importance to the 3 member countries and to the North American region it has helped shape. But also because we think that it's an important first test of how the challenges to international trade in the US will be channeled. Using hyperbolic license, where NAFTA goes, so goes trade. So this is an opportunity to think together about the economic and political arguments against NAFTA advanced by the Trump administration, but also about the critiques that have been raised by scholars, policy analysts, and civil society organizations for quite some time. In the US, these concerns include jobs, displacement, wage decline, rising economic insecurity, and inequality. The position of the Trump administration has reopened NAFTA and has forced us to reevaluate its legacy and that of similar agreements in the wealth and well-being of our nations. We're witnessing the emergence of economic nationalism, which makes it increasingly appealing to blame international trade for many of the economic ills of society and attribute the problems to other countries, be it because trade is inherently problematic or because the other countries are cheating. At its worst, this emerging economic nationalism, when predicated in blaming the other, can have xenophobic and racist undertones. A common and relatively easy response for those who have supported liberal globalization is to dismiss these claims as not understanding economic trade theory, or to argue that the problem is not international trade, but technology. In this view, what is needed is to better explain the benefits of trade, and at any rate, the problem lies elsewhere, at the national level, in the policies each country puts in place to distribute those gains. I find both positions increasingly limited because there have been robust debates within trade theory that show that the many conditions that need to obtain for trade to increase welfare. And we have also been made aware of the significant distributional consequences that trade may have. Consequences that would give us pause in any other policy domain and that we may not be ready to accept without subjecting those choices to greater scrutiny and ensuring that they conform to what our society considers fair. So the most important question we want to probe or begin to address is whether there is space for an alternative globalization, in this case an alternative NAFTA, not its repudiation, but also not its simple continuation with minor cosmetic changes. Can we use this opportunity to reimagine the treaty in the service of a more prosperous region, and therefore a more prosperous United States, a more prosperous Mexico, and a more prosperous Canada? What would that NAFTA look like? Can we use this crisis as an opening to experiment and to take seriously the backlash and the discontent that has fanned this political opposition to trade? In his book, The Affluent Society, John Kenneth Galbraith developed the idea of conventional wisdom. Reading it recently, I found it refreshing and prescient for the times we live. Galbraith posited that because in economic and social phenomena, in contrast to physical phenomena, it is hard to test what exists and what does not, the individual is allowed to believe what he wants. As a result, he argued, and let me quote him here, in the interpretation of all social life, there is a persistent and never-ending competition between what is right and what is merely acceptable. In this competition, while a strategic advantage lies with what exists, all tactical advantage is with the acceptable. Audiences of all kinds must applaud what they like best. And in social comment, the test of audience approval, far more than the test of truth, comes to influence comment. He goes on to note that this has no specific political valence, and it's observed in those who think of themselves as liberals and conservatives. He continues to say, and I quote again, "The enemy of the conventional wisdom is not the ideas, but the march of events. The conventional wisdom accommodates itself not to the world that it is meant to interpret, but to the audience's view of the world. Since the latter remains with the comfortable and the familiar, while the world moves on, the conventional wisdom is always in danger of obsolescence. The fatal blow to the conventional wisdom comes when the conventional ideas fail signally to deal with some contingency to which obsolescence has made them palpably inapplicable. This, sooner or later, must be the fate of ideas which have lost their relation to the world." End of quote. So I would like to suggest that political events of these last 2 years may have shown some cracks in the conventional wisdom, and that perhaps this is a good opportunity to revisit our ideas and test whether we're operating solely in the realm of the familiar, or we're willing to venture to new, unknown territory, even if these ideas are not met with approval. We have designed 3 panels for you. In designing them, we have sought to include ideological and geographical diversity. We have invited current and former government officials, some of whom were there at the creation of NAFTA 23 years ago. We have invited scholars, policy analysts, and members of civil society and non-governmental organizations. The objective is to elicit a stimulating and productive debate in the forum of a university. This civil exchange of ideas is precisely one of the missions and privileges of the university. The panels build up on one another. So the first panel, called The Balance of Nafta, seeks to give us a diagnosis. What have the effects of NAFTA been on the 3 countries? Did it achieve what it promised? If not, where are the disappointments? Who won and who lost from the treaty in each country? What were the treaty's institutional innovations and its dysfunctions? Shall we promote its continuation? This diagnosis leads us to our second panel, called Whether NAFTA 2.0, and we would like speakers to analyze what each of the countries is prioritizing in the negotiations, and what, in their view, should each country ought to be pushing for. What are the areas of possible consensus and which ones of friction? What would a NAFTA that incorporates the lesson of these 23 years would look like? What are the potential competing NAFTAs? And what different visions do they represent? Has NAFTA struck the right balance between the rights of capital and labor? Between those of private interest and the common public? Does NAFTA provide enough regulatory space for development policies? And if not, what would that space look like? The second panel will be followed by lunch and our keynote given by Karen Antebi, who is the economic counselor for NAFTA and trade in the Mexican embassy in Washington. It's not surprising to hear the position of the US government in the voice of its president and different representatives. Their statements and declarations reverberate through the region, and they are heard loudly, as it's natural, in the capital city. The view of the other NAFTA parties is often not so well known, and we're glad for the opportunity to engage with the views of the Mexican government in our keynote. Finally, our third panel moves to the national level. If, as theory predicts, there will be losers from trade, What are countries doing to compensate them and to distribute the accrued gains in a way that makes trade legitimate? And equally important, if NAFTA has turned out not to be a development strategy on its own, and this might be particularly important for Mexico, what national policies can countries undertake to promote growth in a way that complements the treaty? As you can see, these are not easy questions, but we have assembled bright minds with ample experience in the field that can shed light in many of these challenges. We very much hope that this will be an invigorating day for the panelists and for the audience. And if we can't find the answers to these questions today, don't worry, we will invite you back. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors and co-organizers, the Georgetown Latin American Initiative, the Center for Latin American Studies, and the Latin American Leadership Program. With this conference, we are relaunching Carola, the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas, in what we hope will be the beginning of many projects like this. I would also like to thank our Office of Special Events, particularly Deborah Gales, and a very special thanks to Mario Osorio and Regina Trigo for their dedication, time, and energy in organizing the conference. Without them, it would not have been possible. And of course, a special thanks to our panelists and to all of you for joining us in what we hope will be a very productive discussion. Thank you. So now we're going to proceed to our first panel, and I'm going to leave the room to Duncan Wood, who is the director of the Mexican Institute of the Wilson Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alvaro. Good morning, everybody. Let me just congratulate you, Alvaro. That was a fantastic and extremely eloquent opening speech. I'm afraid I won't be able to match that at all. I can't even see your face right now. You've disappeared behind the podium. So there we go. I can see you right now. That was terrific. Also, it was long enough so that Mark could join us on stage. And, welcome, Mark. It's nice to have you here. You made that fashionably late entrance. I always like that. And congratulations also for the Carola. That's an incredible initiative and something that at the Wilson Center we'd be delighted to work with you on programming in terms of rule of law in the Americas. Today, you look at this the agenda for today's conference, and sometimes you think, well, best laid plans and all that, right? Thinking about NAFTA 2.0 now may be a little bit wishful thinking. Thinking about domestic measures to bolster NAFTA, maybe a little bit of wishful thinking. Maybe we're looking at a post-NAFTA reality, as some of our panelists are going to be talking about today. And I want to begin with a little analogy. For those of you who are in or who have ever been in a relationship with somebody else, and you think it's going really well, and then all of a sudden they come to you and they say, look, we need to talk. And you say, all right, I'm willing to talk. And they say, yeah, but I've got some real issues with the way that you are. And you say, look, I understand, I'm not perfect. Let's sit down, I'm willing to change. And then they begin to put forward issues for you. And you say, well, those are the things that I really can't change. I mean, those are things which are kind of like, let's just call them red line issues, shall we? And they come back and they say, well, those are exactly the things that I want to talk about. And those are the things I want you to change. And you say, but we've been in this relationship now for a couple of decades and we've been getting on fine. Well, what is it that you don't like about me now? And he said, it's not you, it's me. I've changed. Now, at that point in a relationship, you got to think about, are you going to head for the door, or are you going to persist, or are you going to get a really good lawyer? And I think we're at the point where you need to have the best damn lawyer in the country on your side, because this is reaching a critical moment. And that's why we're here today. We want to have an open, frank conversation about NAFTA. This panel, we're going to talk about its pros and cons, who won, who lost, sort of macro and micro, and I think that's an important conversation. It's a conversation we've been having for a long time in Washington, D.C. Go back to 2015, a lot of the meetings that we had in the think tank world were all about the fact that, yes, NAFTA on balance had been successful, but there were a lot of losers, and we hadn't done enough to compensate people and to find ways for them to take advantage of the potential benefits of NAFTA. Inevitably, we're going to talk a little bit about the future here. We know that that's reserved for the second panel of the day, but I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit. What can be done and what comes, as I would say with my English accent, after NAFTA, but it should be after NAFTA. because it sounds better as an American. And so I'd just like to welcome our panelists. I'm not going to read out their bios. I'm going to introduce them as it's their turn to speak. And we're going to begin with Rufus Yerxa, Ambassador, President of the National Foreign Trade Council. Rufus, would you like to lead us off with some comments, 5, 8 minutes, something like that?
Sure. Is my mic on, I hope? Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Alvaro, for setting the context. Certainly a very good, I would expect this from an accomplished academic, a good intellectual framework for our discussions. I'm going to give more of on-the-ground business perspective, since that's kind of the interest group I'm working with now. But I also want to thank Duncan for explaining to me the nature of the world we live in today with regard to relationships. As somebody who's been, in the same relationship for 35 years through all kinds of changes, I think there's a huge value to loyalty within relationships, and to understanding that change is a part of life and that you have to adapt rather than break the relationships that you build over time. But that's maybe a bit too personal for this group. But let me go back, if I can, to the world when NAFTA was originally negotiated. I actually was involved in the putting together of the final deal, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think it's important to remember that at the time NAFTA was completed, there were literally no major free trade agreement relationships in the world, other than, of course, the European, well, at that time, the European Community, now European Union, which, of course, was it was a customs union, a free trade agreement, but it was really the only significant economic bloc based on something other than the rules of the multilateral system. I mean, there were a few other small ones in the world, but really, the U.S. had negotiated an agreement with Canada in 1988. The U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement was the first really major FTA other than the EC. And then, of course, NAFTA in 93. Now, fast forward to today, we live in a world where I think there are over 400 free trade agreements that have been notified to the WTO's RTA transparency agreement. Literally everybody's doing it, so to speak. And this has happened, of course, after a significant strengthening of the broader multilateral regime that had really governed trade relations. So, the Uruguay round and the WTO agreement was a quantum leap forward in the multilateral system, much deeper commitments, much broader in terms of the areas of trade and even domestic regulation, which were covered by it, and the international dispute process. So on top of that, we then had what I would call an incredible era of competitive liberalization. So interesting to think that if the U.S., perish the thought that if the U.S. were to decide that it no longer wanted to be part of NAFTA, we would actually see a situation from a point of view of businesses where both Japan and Europe would have free trade relationships with Mexico and Canada, but the U.S. would not. And that just, to me, is one symptom of the kind of debate we're in today, because I think it's really, a momentous decision to begin to turn your back on something which has really become the norm rather than the exception in the international trading system. And in fact, everybody's accelerating that process globally. So the European-Canada FTA just went into effect not too long ago. I think it was last week or the week before.
Great boon for maritime seafood.
The Europeans are deepening their relationship with Mexico. Of course, the Japanese have FTAs. The TPP 11 are still talking about going forward. All of this is just to point out to you, it's important for Americans to understand the context in which our domestic policy debate over trade agreements is taking place, the broader global context. Just a couple of points to get to, what I'm supposed to talk about, which is what did NAFTA deliver? What was its value? What was its importance? I also want to take you back to the beginning of that process. I came home from Geneva, where I had been working on the Uruguay round WTO negotiations in 1993, just in time to be appointed to negotiate the labor and environment side agreements with Canada and Mexico. We had already, the Bush administration had signed the NAFTA accord, but President Clinton, who had just been elected, had announced that he wasn't going to put it forward until he negotiated these two side agreements, and I was the U.S. negotiator. My counterparts were Emilio Blanco, the then Vice Minister of Mexico, and John Weeks of Canada. And I remember very well the kind of environment we were facing, because first of all, there was tremendous opposition to the underlying NAFTA agreement from many, many groups. And secondly, there was tremendous opposition to the notion that labor and environment had anything to do with trade agreements, both from the Republican establishment in this town and from most of the business community. And President Clinton was pretty determined to draw that relationship and to say we had to have some kind of respect for those kinds of values in a deeper free trade relationship. Now people look back on the labor and environment agreements, and I think, one of the main areas of criticism is that those didn't go far enough, and even business now supporting deeper, broader commitments, the kind that are reflected, for example, in the TPP agreement, which, apparently wasn't enough for President Trump, but if you look at how much more extensive the commitments are, my main point here is to talk about what evolves in a process of economic integration and how both political perspectives, economic interests, and values evolve over time. And so, I would not at all be surprised to see, as part of this process, agreement among the three countries to do much more in both the labor and environment field, although I'm not sure about the U.S. administration's position on environment. But that, to me, is just one indication of how things change over time and what the challenges now are. Now, to look at what really was the promise of NAFTA and what was delivered, I was uncomfortable at the time we debated NAFTA, that the debate very much turned into kind of a very mechanical jobs debate, because in the final analysis, deeper economic integration and reduction of barriers to commerce across borders cannot be boiled down to a simple position of who gains and who loses jobs. Huge fundamental shifts in entire industries, the way they're structured, the way they conduct their business. I would argue that certainly the promise that was delivered in NAFTA is a much stronger North American economic platform, much stronger industrial performance and ability to compete with the rest of the world. Look at the auto sector, for example. Not only a manufacturing revival in automobiles in the U.S., but a North American platform now, which is much, much better. We're exporting 2 million automobiles a year from the United States. We see a flood of investment coming into North America, and the U.S. becoming a much more potent manufacturer. Does that mean that it translated into more jobs in the U.S.? Well, look at the way autos are produced today compared to the way they were at the time of NAFTA, and you're talking about fewer than a third the number of workers to produce an automobile that you used to. So economic integration is both about increased trade, but it's also about economic efficiency, and that has, I have no doubt, some real implications for jobs and for workers. The notion that you hear from our current president that this has somehow killed the U.S. manufacturing sector, let's put it in perspective a little bit. So Mexico's economy as a whole is somewhere around $7 to 8% the size of the U.S. economy. I guess if you do GDP on a purchasing power parity basis, it's a little higher. Canada's is about 8% of the U.S. economy. The entire trade deficit in goods that the U.S. has with Mexico of $60 billion sounds like a lot of money. In an $18.5 trillion economy, it's about 0.2% of our economy, which means it's about the size of the GDP of Birmingham, Alabama. That's the size of our deficit with Mexico. Now, true, trade and investment in all directions has increased substantially, and there's been, you know, an increase in U.S. exports to Mexico from 50 billion to something like 300 billion in goods and services. It's really interesting to see what this means in Mexico, because I think U.S. exports to Mexico represent something like 20% of Mexico's GDP. Mexican imports to the U.S. represent, I think, much, much less than 2% of our GDP. So if you want to talk about a country that completely opened and fundamentally changed as a result of an agreement, look at Mexico. I mean, before NAFTA, it was a closed, relatively closed economy. By the way, a one-party political system with largely state-owned companies. It's an entirely different economy today. And certainly from the U.S. point of view, a better neighbor in many, many respects, including, by the way, immigration. You wouldn't know it from the current immigration debate, but we actually have net out-migration from the U.S. to Mexico. I can tell you that was not the case at the time NAFTA was negotiated. And this sort of rambling discourse is a way of saying there's been so many fundamental changes in the trade and economic relationship among all three. I haven't talked as much about U.S.-Canada, but there has been so much of a change. The real question now is, what do those who think withdrawal from the agreement is a viable option really perceive as the future evolution of the North American economy, and what kind of damage will that do to things that have evolved over the past 20 years? And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rufus. That was terrific. And just to build on one of the points you made, a friend of mine who is in the auto parts industry in Mexico recently sent me a little video of a robot that they've just installed in one of their factories that performs a simple task of assembling one part of the brake system that they make there. And he said this is a robot that costs $30,000, and its total running costs are equivalent to $2.20 per hour. It replaces a worker that does that. And he said, of course, it's much more efficient. There are very few errors that actually come out of this. And that's one of the things that I think we have not made a clear enough case on, which is that we talk about trade as if it happens within a vacuum of the transformation of our economies in general. And it's one of the things that we're looking at very closely at the Wilson Center in terms of automation and the need for workforce development. But unfortunately, I think we all got to the table a little bit late in terms of influencing the public debate. Let me turn to my colleague from the Wilson Center, Laura Dawson, who is the director of the Canada Institute. Laura, you are a trade expert for, I'm not going to say decades and decades, because it makes you sound older than you are. But you've been studying this both from the point of view of Canada and, of course, as a mole within the American government for a while. So over to you.
Thank you. What a great introduction. A mole. I just so as you know, it wasn't a covert operation. I was the economic. After I left university in Canada as a trade professor, I became an economic advisor to a couple of the U.S. ambassadors in Ottawa, because God knows a little knowledge about softwood lumber and steel goes a long way. I'm going to give Alvaro a little bit of deep background, because he was promoting that at the beginning. Free trade with the United States, continental trade is in Canadian DNA. It's not a thing that occurred in 1994 or 1988. Truck or trade with the Yankees is a defining part of Canadian history since about 1776, when you all became Yankees. And your relationship with British North America and the trade deficit between the North and the South, and whether or not we should have reciprocity and send you, I'm a Canadian, send you our staples and our raw materials, and you would send us back your manufactured goods. Governments in Canada fell on that. 1911, Wilfrid Laurier lost the election on a reciprocity issue. 1937, Mackenzie King had a seance with his dead mother and his live dog, and the dead mother said, "Don't you do a reciprocity treaty with the United States, it'll only go badly for you." And so we took our instructions from Mackenzie King's mother up until 1988, where Canada made what everyone considered to be a leap of faith and did a trade agreement with the United States. And this was a big deal. This did fundamentally change the pattern of Canadian trade. It was still primarily a staples exporter. It didn't have strong domestic manufacturing except for those U.S. branch plants that had established there. Canadians were terrified. The Americans were kind of come up and take over our schools, take over our healthcare, inculcate our TV. Oh, wait, you did that. And so it was a really big deal. And all of the adjustment pains that people talk about in the 90s, Canada actually went through earlier on and lost a lot of sectors, gained things as well. They lost the ever important jug wine industry, cheap plonk in Niagara, but they gained services. They gained ability in little companies like Nortel and BlackBerry. So it's been part of Canadian DNA for a really long time, and it's incredibly important, having made the leap to open trade. Again, Canada, giant country, tiny population, 34 million people-ish, about the same size in GDP population-wise as California, all spread out within about 100 miles of the U.S. border. So trade is essential to Canada. I'm going to go back to the statistic that Rufus brought out. GDP, Canada's GDP that's dependent on trade is about 20%. We are each, with the U.S., we are each other's largest trading partner. But U.S. GDP that comes from Canada trade is about 2%. So it's a big disparity. And that asymmetry is incredibly challenging. NAFTA is the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth stories in the Globe and Mail and CBC every day. It is page 18 on the Cleveland Plain Dealer in the United States. So getting that sustained attention to the importance of this agreement has been a big challenge for Canada. Canada is diversifying, like Mexico, signed a lot of free trade agreements as part of the TPP, has an agreement with the European Union, is about to start negotiations with China, but none of the diversification substitutes for secure access with the neighbors. I'm going to jump ahead now to where they are in the negotiations. Anything that I say about what's going on the Canadian negotiating team side is just a pretty good hunch, and anything that I say that's wrong is completely my fault. But my friends in Canada are very, very worried right now that the negotiations have dissolved into two negotiations. One is pretty good. It's the modernization negotiation. This is the one we all talked about. Hey, we'll bring in some things from the TPP. We'll talk about digital modernization. We'll upgrade customs procedures at the border. We'll have new rules of origin. We'll talk about anti-corruption. It'll be great. And in fact, it has been pretty good. They've made some pretty good progress there. We're not sure how much progress, actually, because of the interagency clearance process with the United States, because of the need to get U.S. text approved at so many different levels. The U.S. just hasn't been bringing text to the table. Canada, Mexico have been bringing text to the table, but the U.S. has just intimated that we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to take a hard line. So the only thing they've really kind of gotten through start to finish is small and medium-sized enterprises. There are 28 tables in operation, and we expect that the Canadians say they expect that they will have consolidated text, that is, proposals from all three sides for all chapters by the end of the next round, which will be 4 of Scheduled 7. So they're making good progress in some key areas. And the irony is that these key areas, like border facilitation, using better technologies and risk management processes at the border, are probably worth more on a value basis than Canadian dairy access, or well, I don't know about Chapter 19, but many of the things that are the hard line in the sand issues that the negotiations are getting caught up on are actually not as important by value as the things that are in this modernization agenda. So we're losing, I think, this modernization, this alt-NAFTA that Alvaro was talking about, a North American competitiveness agenda, as though North American competitiveness actually mattered. I think we're running the risk of losing that because there are a core set of issues that are being proposed by the United States that aren't modernization, that aren't even holding the line. Everybody's got their issues they hold the line on. The US has the Jones Act, Canada has dairy, et cetera, et cetera. But these aren't even holding the line. These are turning the clock back decades. Pre-NAFTA, pre-Uruguay round, pre-Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, protectionist, unilateral trade instruments, the likes of which we have never seen before in areas of dispute settlement, government procurement, national requirements on rules of origin. And you have real lawyers here who can talk to you about that. I'm just a pretender. But these issues, which are the core sort of dialing back the clock, are issues that are untenable for Canada and probably for Mexico, because both Canada and Mexico have said, we will enter this negotiation to improve and modernize the NAFTA. We are not going to step back. We are not going to accept any outcome tomorrow that is worse than what we have today. So when you've got these regressive proposals for these key areas, it seems, at least to the Canadian folks that I've been talking to, that they're going to have to walk away from these negotiations. And that would be a very unhappy outcome. I know that they're talking to some of their US partners about potential legal actions that US industries or associations could take to at least slow down the potential withdrawal process that Donald Trump might initiate. So that's where the Canadian thinking is on this, and that's very unfortunate. Also, I think Canada's got a bit of a history with successfully walking away from negotiations. 1980, well, pre-Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, the negotiations were falling apart in the mid-80s on, wait for it, Chapter 19 appeals panels, and Canada walked away from the negotiations. So we cannot complete a deal under these circumstances. And they had somebody in the White House who said, give the Canadians what they want. So they did get a successful outcome on that deal. I don't see any possibility of history repeating itself in this context. So Canadians are on every street corner in Washington. They're on every street corner in every, beside every governor's mansion in the United States, reinforcing the importance of this deal, trying to salvage what can be salvaged before it's too late. They recognize that the U.S. has a lot of legislative concerns going on, and that after, North Korea, tax reform, healthcare, etc., the NAFTA is really low down on the U.S. priority list. Canadians are still freaked out by the fact that U.S. politics drives so close to the edge, so close to the cliff, and then turns back. That's not something they get. We like things that are incremental, predictable, orderly, etc. And so I think we're in a difficult position to elaborate on Duncan's metaphor about the relationship. It's not just that the other partner has said, I've been rethinking some things. I want things different. This is the partner who stops shaving, stops bathing, starts chasing women around. He's trying to force the other partner out of the relationship, and I think that's the way the Canadians are feeling. Final point: Canada does have a strong commitment to Mexico. It wasn't a match made in heaven in 1994. Canadians were like, what? Mexico's coming in this deal? Why would we want that? But with gradual integration of supply chains and recognizing the value that Mexico brings to that trilateral relationship, Canada and Mexico are very much embedded traders. You don't see a lot of two-way trade necessarily, but you see a great deal of three-way trade. And you look at companies like Bombardier, Canadian companies in the auto sector, those Canadian companies that do funky designs for high-tech products in the auto sector in Toronto, their success is fueled by really skilled Mexican workers who can take those designs and elaborate them into effective and affordable products with a global market. So that's me finishing up, Duncan.
Thank you, Laura. As entertaining and informative as always. And I want to go back to this point of the commitment of Canada to free trade with the United States. I guess over a decade ago, I was sitting at a seminar in Mexico, and a renowned eminence grise, shall we say, of Canadian foreign policy came down and talked about the priorities of Canadian foreign policy. And number one was, protect the Canadian homeland. Number two, keep the border open. And that was a sort of a very stark statement for me that it's up there. It's an existential question for Canada to keep the border open with the United States so that goods can get across into the market south. And I would say that, and I don't want to anticipate Gerardo's comments here, but I would say that we've seen something very, very similar in terms of Mexico, which is that the border with the United States, at least in terms of goods, the transportation of goods and trade, has become equally important. But Gerardo, I won't speak for you. You can speak for yourself. Gerardo Esquivel, professor from the Colegio de Mexico, good friend of many people here in Washington, particularly the Wilson Center. Delighted to have you here.
Thank you. May I stand over here?
You may.
Because I want to show you a couple of graphs. Sorry about that. Let me show you this to start with these two graphs, which are it's rather unfortunate that you cannot see the results of these surveys. These are three surveys conducted in the three participating countries in NAFTA. And this is what I would say. I'm sorry that the question is in Spanish, but that's the way it was produced in Mexico. But the idea is very simple. It's what's the perception of the impact of NAFTA in any given country, whether it's positive or negative. These are, as I said, three surveys conducted in the three participating countries. And as you can see there, people in the three countries in general believes that NAFTA has been a good thing for the countries. In the USA, 51%, in Mexico, 60%, and in Canada, 74% believe that NAFTA has been a good thing for the countries. So NAFTA has been good in general, at least in the perception for people in the three countries. However, in what I would say is what I would call the Nafta paradox. It is the fact that when you ask them, to people in the same three countries, who do you think has benefited the most? This is the answers they give. It doesn't add up to 100 because not everyone responded. But in Mexico, Mexicans believe, 46% of Mexicans believe that Americans are the ones that have benefited the most. Only 12% of Mexicans believe that Mexicans have benefited the most. In the USA, they think that the Mexicans have benefited the most, 41%, compared to only 17% of Americans that believe they have benefited the most. And in Canada, they believe that both Mexicans and Americans have benefited the most. So everybody is happy with NAFTA, but everybody thinks that others have reaped the benefits of NAFTA, mostly. So I think this is very paradoxical because in the end, we all are happy with NAFTA, as you can see here. We all understand the benefits of NAFTA, but we are not completely happy in relative terms of who has benefited the most from this agreement. And I think here is where we are in this situation in which we should move from the economic dimension of NAFTA, the economics of NAFTA, to the political economy of NAFTA. I mean, we should understand that, and I think we are in this new dimension, which is different. I mean, instead of discussing what we used to discuss 20 years ago of what were the benefits or what could be the benefits of economic integration, of more trade, more foreign direct investment and so on, which was the discussion 2 decades ago, we are now in this discussion of who benefits the most and who is hurt by these trade agreements. And this is interesting because, as I said, probably before NAFTA went into effect, most people, if you ask, at least in Mexico, thought that Mexico was going to be the country most benefited by NAFTA for just one simple reason. Mexico was the poorest country in the agreement. Mexico has this idea and was this promise was sold to the Mexicans by then President Carlos Salinas de Gortari that by joining NAFTA, we could actually join the ranks of first world economies. Back in 1993, when President Salinas went to MIT and gave the commencement address, he said these very famous words: "We want to export goods, not people." After that, what we have exported have been goods and people. I mean, for many, many years, not now, but for many, many years, we exported a lot of goods, but also a lot of people, as you all know. This is part of the issues here in the U.S. But not only that, this is important to understand, because when people start talking about NAFTA in Mexico, particularly Mexican officials, they gave us all these figures on trade and foreign direct investment and so on, and there's no doubt that has increased substantially in Mexico, between Mexico and other countries, particularly with North American countries. But in the end, we should understand what's the motivation behind NAFTA, what was the motivation for Mexican people. And it is important to remember what President Salinas said back then. He said, "At the end of this century, global trade is the way to improve the standard of living of our populations. That's why we in Mexico have proposed to the US and to Canada a free trade agreement. NAFTA is a job-creating agreement because by increasing competitions in our three nations and its competitive capacity, it would allow us to compete with regions which are getting together in Europe and in the Asian Pacific countries." So it was perceived, NAFTA, and that's the way in which it was sold to Mexicans. There was a way to improve the standard of living, not just to increase trade and foreign direct investment. So that's my point. But instead, when you look at what has happened in Mexico, for example, in terms of development, which is, and I think Mark has a lot to say about this, and it's in his very nice updated version of his paper, which was distributed at the entrance. I'm just going to show you this graph, which is probably summarizes what I think has happened in Mexico after NAFTA, which is, this is the Mexico-US ratio of GDP per capita and GDP per person employed from 1990 to 2015. As you can see, there is no convergence. What you should expect, and what was expected to happen, is that since Mexico was lagging behind the US and Canada, what should happen was some sort of convergence of different kinds, in terms of wages, in terms of income per capita, in terms of productivity. That's what we should expect to happen. I mean, that was the idea. That was the economics of all this, was to bring together two very different economies, or three very different economies, and that something like convergence should take place. Well, that hasn't happened. Mexico's GDP per capita relative to the US is now pretty much the same it was back in the 1990s. It is even below it was before the beginning of NAFTA. So the gap is still there. There has been no closing of the gap in the past 2 decades. And when you look at the red line, which is GDP per person employed, or something like labor productivity, that has even declined. So when you ask yourself, has NAFTA benefited Mexico? Has NAFTA fulfilled its promise to the Mexicans? The answer is clearly not. And that's why when you ask Mexicans who has benefited the most, Mexicans do not believe that Mexicans have benefited the most from NAFTA. Even though we all have benefited, and we all agree with this. We have benefited as consumers, of course. I mean, the basket of goods that is available for everyone in North America is much wider than it used to be, and so on. But has not fulfilled its promises of development, not for the Mexicans. And if you look at graph 2B of Mark's nice paper, you will see that Mexico has grown even at a smaller rate than the rest of Latin America, which do not have NAFTA. So I'm not saying that this is because of NAFTA. Let me make that clear. And I'm very happy that we have a table at the end of today's session which is on the domestic issues that have to be addressed. Because a lot of this, the lack of convergence between Mexico and the rest of North America, it is due to the fact that Mexico has not done other things to emphasize the benefits of NAFTA, or to enhance the benefits of NAFTA. So let me just end by saying this. When you think about this NAFTA in Mexico, a lot of people think of the auto industry that has moved a lot of its production to Mexico, and that's good for Mexico, and I would agree that it's good for Mexico. But when you start looking at what has happened with all these global manufacturers in Mexico, these global value chains in Mexico and what is the outcome of this for the Mexican people, for example, in terms of the distribution of the value added between capital and labor, you see a graph like this. A graph like this, which is like today, like close to 70% of all the value added goes to capital and just 1/3 goes to labor, which used to be 50-50. Just to give you an idea, in the US, the distribution of value added between capital and labor is exactly the opposite. 2/3 to labor, 1/3 to capital. And if you think this is global value chain production, let me give you what's the distribution between capital and labor value added in the auto industry, which is the one at the extremes of this distribution. Close to 93% of total value added in the auto industry production in Mexico goes to the owners of capital, and just 5 or 6% goes to the workers. And that's important because that's when you start understanding why all this increase in production, all this increase in trade, all this increase in foreign direct investment doesn't necessarily mean that has benefited workers in Mexico. Of course, they earn more than typical workers in Mexico, but they don't earn nearly as much as other workers in different parts of the world that do the same job. So, and in that sense, I think on this discussion, on these renegotiation discussions, the idea of emphasizing issues like labor aspects, I think it goes in the right direction for Mexican people too. And I'm happy that the Canadians are bringing this into the discussion because part of the reasons why a lot of people in Mexico is not willing to support something like NAFTA, which, as I said at the beginning, I think it's good for Mexico, has been good for Mexico. It is for the fact that a lot of people doesn't feel like we have any benefits from this agreement. And that's why a lot of people is not defending NAFTA, surprisingly. If you see who is defending NAFTA in Mexico, it's basically officials and some parts of the private sector, the big business in Mexico, but not the medium-sized enterprises, not the micro enterprises, not the small firms, because they don't feel like they have benefited at all from NAFTA. Probably that's wrong, as I said, but that's the way it is perceived in Mexico. And I think in that sense, perception is very important. And that's why I think we are now in the context not of the economics of NAFTA, the economics of integration, but in terms of the political economy of what an agreement like this represents for the three different countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerardo. That's extraordinarily important information you put up on the screen and discussed with us, and just emphasizing that shift that's occurring in the economy in general. And the reason why a lot of people feel as though NAFTA has not really been beneficial to them. And I'd like to come back when we get into general discussion. I'd like to talk about the need for national debates over NAFTA and the fact that we really haven't had anything approximating a national and open debate on these questions. Next up is Simon Lester. Simon is a trade policy analyst at the Cato Institute. Simon, thank you. You sent me some comments you're going to make last night, so I know more or less where you're going to go. But I think your comments will build on very nicely from what Gerardo has just said.
Thank you, Duncan. Let me confess at the outset that I spent most of my life working on WTO issues, WTO dispute settlement, and so I'm a little shocked that anyone thinks I'm qualified to be on this NAFTA panel. These NAFTA experts who have been studying it or even drafting it in some cases. A couple of years ago, I sort of looked like the TPP might supersede NAFTA, and I thought, great, I don't really have to learn NAFTA. I'll just learn the TPP, and then I'll be covered. But here we are. Things have changed, and we've all had to scramble a little bit and figure out NAFTA and write things about NAFTA and talk about NAFTA at conferences. So I'd like to put all my cards out on the table and just start by telling you where I'm coming from on these issues. I'm a strong proponent of free trade, and I think trade agreements are a pretty good way to get there. But I don't have blind allegiance to everything in trade agreements. There's this famous quote from a New York Times columnist, Tom Friedman, which is something like, I supported the CAFTA. I didn't even know what was in it. I just knew two words, free trade. Well, I want to know what's in these trade agreements. And there are plenty of things in there that I'm skeptical of. So to give you some examples, the business community is often promoting stronger intellectual property protection and investor-state dispute settlement. I've tried to look into the evidence, and I just don't see it there. I just don't see that there are any great economic value from this. And in the case of some of the intellectual property protections, I actually think there's some harm. And then on the other side, I also have a problem with people on the left who want labor and environmental provisions in trade agreements. I don't think they belong there. That doesn't mean I don't think there should be no international labor and environmental cooperation. I just don't think it should be part of a trade agreement. So with that in mind, how do we evaluate the contributions of NAFTA? What do we think of it? What were the successes? What are the weaknesses? I could spend the whole time on those four, but those always feel kind of nitpicky to me. To me, that's not the bulk of what's in trade agreements, what's in NAFTA. And so when I think about how we evaluate NAFTA, I think of sort of three broad core features of it. And I'll go through each one. So the first is it's sort of an international relations exercise, creating this North American economic community. The second is, and I think this is sort of the core of it, it's a set of policies that liberalize trade mostly. And then third, it's a set of institutions. So let me go through each of those and what I think of them, how NAFTA has succeeded or not. So the first one, international relations, and this is the one I know the least about, but it seems to me that this has been mostly positive. When you have a preferential trade agreement of this sort, you bring the countries involved closer together. And my sense is that the NAFTA countries are closer now than they have been pre-NAFTA or pre-Canada-US FTA. The U.S. and Mexico are much closer now than they have been through most of their history. That may all change soon, but that's not the fault of NAFTA. That's other things going on. With NAFTA in place, when there are trade conflicts, we have this institutional structure to help deal with them. And so overall, it seems to me North American relations are better because of NAFTA. Now, there is a possible negative to that. Those of us who are multilateralists think, well, these preferential trade agreements actually distract us from a better kind of liberalization that's out there. And I know there are many people, and I'm one of them, who are trying to figure out how can we get governments to refocus on multilateralism. And so there's always this tension there between regionalism and multilateralism, and then bilateralism and plurilateralism. So, all right, so that's international relations. But here, of course, is the key one: is the trade liberalization that NAFTA carries out. NAFTA removes almost all tariffs between the three countries, and constrains many other forms of protectionism. And this, I think, this is where most of the backlash is coming from. There are some people who say, "Well, we were hurt by all of this." To me, this trade liberalization is almost always good on balance, and that's an important qualification that Duncan put out there at the beginning. On balance, we're better off with trade liberalization and avoiding protectionism. Now, I sometimes hear criticism of economists, and I'm not one, I'm a lawyer, but people say, well, economists didn't acknowledge the short-term harms that were caused by trade liberalization. I've never met these economists. All the economists I know, carefully weigh the benefits and the harms, and I think they're pretty clear about it. Now, obviously there are people who are not economists who are sort of talking, publicly about this, and maybe they didn't sort of fully acknowledge the harms that would come about through trade liberalization. But I think that that may be too much to expect, to have that good of a public discourse where everything gets talked about with that much nuance. I think that the people, sort of the experts behind the scenes pushing this, I think we're pretty aware of how trade liberalization work, what the benefits would be, how some people might be harmed by it. Now, why am I so strongly, against protectionism, for trade liberalization? And that really is what motivates me to do, what I do. Look, I know that in theory there's this narrow case for using protectionism in some circumstances to your benefit, but it just seems to me that even if there's a theoretical case for it, in practice, it's not going to work very well for you. And a colleague of mine at the Cato Institute recently did a paper where he sort of surveyed all the economic studies of U.S. protectionism that he could find throughout history, and the verdict is pretty clear. You're going to make yourself worse off using protectionism. Again, on balance, I mean, yes, you can certainly enrich certain people by using protectionism, but on balance, we're all going to be worse off. And that's sort of the big picture. We can get into sort of concrete examples of, well, the North American car industry is much more efficient now, and isn't it great that we get all the Mexican avocados and tomatoes in here? But so generally speaking, it's just I'm happy to we could have a debate and discussion about this. If trade liberalization is going to make us better off. Now, I do agree with some of the critics that the marketing of trade agreements, NAFTA in particular, has been a bit unrealistic. There are these economic growth predictions that people put out there, these jobs predictions that I think are very unrealistic, and I wish economists wouldn't do this. In evaluating the TPP, and I think this was probably also the case with the NAFTA. You'll get some very specific but kind of arbitrary predictions about $98 billion of economic growth by 2036. And it can't be that simple. Give ranges. Talk with a little more nuance about these things, or else I think you get yourself in trouble down the road if you're out there saying NAFTA will lead to this amount of increased exports, which will create 1 million new jobs. Well, the response is just going to be, well, if the exports create the jobs, well, don't the imports destroy the jobs? And so, I think we need to talk about these things a little differently. Let me focus now, though, on the negatives, the on balance part, the job losses. And so, here's the way I see job losses that arise from trade liberalization. It's not really that they're caused by trade liberalization. They're caused more, I think a better way to think about it is they're caused by a disruption to the status quo. I mean, when you make a big policy change of any sort, it's going to, it could have, sort of negative economic consequences for some people. NAFTA was a big change. Are we better off with it on balance? Yes. Did some people get hurt? Yes, just like they would by various other policy changes. So let me give you some examples. Let's say we decide to withdraw ethanol subsidies or fossil fuel subsidies or whatever subsidies it is you don't like. Some people are probably going to lose their jobs, but that's okay. I don't think we should subsidize inefficient jobs forever. What we need instead, and I think everyone will agree on sort of the general principle here, is we need policies to deal with the consequences of these kind of economic disruptions that could either come about through policy or through technological improvements. The problem, of course, is we don't agree on what those policies should be, and that has to be a whole separate conference. What are we supposed to do to deal with these disruptions? I'll skip that one. Okay, so that's all I'll say about the trade liberalization. Let me talk about the last one. I'm going to say just a little something about institutions. NAFTA doesn't have anything like the WTO. There's no NAFTA building where all the NAFTA employees go to work every day. There's sort of a secretariat, but it's really just these national government employees acting as the secretariat. So it seems to me there's a problem when you don't have this permanent independent staff to do things like supervise the state-to-state dispute settlement, like under Nafta Chapter 20, and that has really suffered as a result. After the U.S. blocked a panel in around 2000. NAFTA complaints dried up. I recently wrote a paper with some colleagues of mine, and I hadn't realized that this was me learning NAFTA. There were a lot of NAFTA Chapter 20 complaints in the early years, and there are sort of 2 or 3 since 2000. I think it's 21 total, and there were about 18 of them in the first couple of years, and then 2 or 3 since then. And I think this is one of the problems with not having the staff there to supervise it. And it's not just dispute settlement; it's also new negotiations and committees. Without those, it seems to me that these trade agreements that were always running out there signing, they just become frozen in time, and hence they need the modernization. I think if we'd had people sort of there, working on this, supervising it all along, NAFTA might not be in the position where we need to modernize it now. We could have sort of updated it as we went along. There are some NAFTA-related bodies that do some things. There's the Regulatory Cooperation Council. There's the Labor and Environmental Commissions. But overall, it seems to me that NAFTA really suffers from this lack of institutional support. Now, I picked a bad time to raise all this, obviously, because I don't think that the Trump administration is going to be very amenable to making any of these kind of changes. That's not what they're after in the NAFTA. I don't think they're all that happy with the WTO Secretariat. But nevertheless, when I look at it, when I try to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the NAFTA, one of my concerns is, well, without this sort of, this institutional support, I don't know how well it will continue to function. So those are my 3 big points, and I'll leave it there and talk more about it.
Thank you so much, Simon. And just to pick up on one of your earlier points, when you were talking about sort of the role of labor, environmental side agreements in a free trade agreement, I think it's one of the big questions that we need to continue to discuss. Is that something that we should have in the treaty, or whether nations are actually responsible? And just as Gerardo said, these are things that national governments need to do to take care of their people, rather than necessarily skirting the issue and putting it into an international agreement. And last week at the Wilson Center, the Mexican ambassador, Jeronimo Gutierrez, talked about the question of ISDS and its importance for the energy sector. And he said, look, if we lose NAFTA, we lose that protection for American and Canadian investors in the Mexican energy sector and other sectors. But he said, what we need to do now as a country is to approve legislation that protects investors so that it's in our legislation that we don't depend upon international treaties. And I think that's something that is an important recognition on the part of national governments. Last but by far means least, I'm going to turn to Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Welcome, Mark. It'll be great to hear your opinions on this.
Thanks. I'm going to use the podium too, actually. It's okay. Thanks. I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors of this to organizing a panel. And, there are so many of these panels in Washington, and usually they only present one point of view. So I'm really glad to see a diversity of views here. And I want to, I like the introduction from Alvaro about conventional wisdom. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of been eroded in the last 20 years has been the conventional wisdom. Rufus mentioned the debates back around NAFTA in 1994. And I remember them very well. I remember Bill Clinton, who ran against NAFTA and said, not this NAFTA, we won't have any, worked about 7 hours a day for many months to pass it against his own party. He couldn't get the Democratic Party to vote for it in Congress. And at that time, there really was not any debate. I remember the editors of the Washington Post saying, we don't really have to print any op-eds on the other side of this because there's really no argument here. It said that openly. And now it's quite different. 20 years of groups like Public Citizen, Sierra Club, the big protests against the WTO. You have a debate on trade and the so-called trade agreements, which I never call them trade agreements because there is, as you pointed out, so much else in there. And often these provisions, and I think it was clearly the case in the TPP, these provisions are economically much more important than the tariff reductions, which by now are very small. And of course, so they are very much protectionist agreements, intellectual property. They're written by corporations. And so I consider this enormous progress. I think we should celebrate the fact that for the first time, at least in my lifetime, you had an agreement that was written by corporations where members of Congress had trouble even seeing it, and it was defeated in spite of the fact that it had not only every major corporation and every wealthy individual practically in the country supporting it, but also the whole national security state, which is a powerful thing here, 17 intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, State Department, and they really, that was part of the debate. They kind of gave up on the economic arguments. By the end of the debate, they were basically saying, you're going to take a hit for this, but this is because we want to maintain our power in Asia. And that was a lot of the argument. But this time you had a whole other side. You had Nobel Prize winning economist Joe Stiglitz. You had who pointed out that, why do we need these investor-to-state dispute settlement mechanisms in this? And Paul Krugman, who had supported NAFTA, became a skeptic, and Jeffrey Sachs, who had supported trade agreements forever, and also so it was a real change, and it was a result of public education, 20 years of public education. So I just want to put that out there as background, because other people are going to talk about the effect of NAFTA on the United States and what can be done. But I want to focus on Mexico right now for my remaining minutes. And I hadn't seen those figures on the capital that Gerardo pointed out on the distribution between capital and labor. And it's very interesting because, you have some studies showing that the income distribution has not really worsened. And I always found those hard to believe, especially since wages, for example, have, since NAFTA in the 23 years, have grown about 4%, basically. Real wages, almost nothing at all. And poverty in Mexico, 2014, which is the latest numbers, is at 55%. It was about the same as it was when NAFTA was passed, which means an extra 20 million people fell below the poverty line, the Mexican poverty line. in the period since NAFTA was passed, because there's population growth. So it's very hard to see. I don't see how anybody, actually, I would love to see anybody in the whole day try to make the argument that this agreement was better for Mexico. I mean, how do you look at it? You can, there's two comparisons. You can compare with the rest of Latin America, and out of 20 economies, since NAFTA, in 2016, Mexico was 15th out of those 20 economies in terms of growth of per capita GDP, which is the most basic measure that economists have of economic progress. So if you look at Mexico compared to Latin America, or you look at the poverty rate, because you can take the CEPAL poverty rate, which is a poverty rate that you can compare the country. So that's different from the Mexican poverty rate. So that shows a small improvement in the poverty rate in Mexico, but you have about 4%, but you have about 4 times that much in the rest of Latin America, excluding Mexico. So again, if you compare growth, poverty, anything that really matters for people to the rest of Latin America, it's very hard to say that that Mexico succeeded on their NAFTA. You could also compare with Mexico's past, which again, is often dismissed. The PRI, authoritarian one-party rule and all that. But if you look at the economy from 1960 to 1980, it grew by the income per person. Again, the average income grew by about 91%. Okay, that means it basically doubled. And over the next 2 decades, it would grow by about 13%. And if you look at the 23 years, so this is a slightly longer period since NAFTA, and how much income per person grew as compared to that 91% during the terrible years of protectionism and developmentalist policies, it grew by 28%, again, as compared to 91%. So, and this is a fair baseline. I mean, the 1970s were not a great decade. You had 2 big oil shocks that, caused world recessions, and you had high inflation. And so, for a baseline, that would be a fair comparison. You could throw the 50s in there. It would probably make it even worse for the NAFTA period. And so it's very hard to point to anything that really makes it look like this period is better for Mexico. Now, you can say, okay, well, that wasn't just NAFTA. And it wasn't just NAFTA. But NAFTA was part, and I think Geraldo has written about this, NAFTA was part of an attempt beginning in the 1980s, a successful one, to transform the Mexican economy into a whole different model of growth that was supposed to make, increase efficiency, increase economic growth, and do this through opening, through liberalizing of investment, and a whole set of reforms that were embodied. The purpose was these reforms were made in the 80s, and then in 1994, this was the design of NAFTA was to lock these into an international treaty so that they would become irreversible. And they did that. And so I think you can associate NAFTA with that. And some of the weaknesses in the Mexican economy, which you see still today, are a result of these whole set of what I would call neoliberal changes that were embodied in NAFTA. For example, this is, I'm not even sure how to explain this, and maybe Geraldo could in the question and answer, but the U.S. economy, I mean, Mexico was tied to the U.S. economy. But this year, it's projected to grow about 1.7%, even though the U.S. economy is doing quite well. And if you knock off population growth, you've got basically almost no growth in income per person at a time when again, its main trading partner is doing very well. Now, obviously, some of this could be the Trump effect and other things, but it was, you could call it bad luck or bad planning, but tying the Mexican economy to the U.S. economy at a time when the U.S. economy became really dependent on bubble growth was not good for Mexico. In the even before that, in the peso crisis, Mexico lost about 9.5% of GDP. When the stock market bubble burst in the U.S., Mexico was hit very hard. And then again, of course, with the Great Recession, where they had some of the worst losses in all of Latin America. I think it was about 6.7% of GDP during that recession. So that hurt Mexico. It also hurt Mexico when the U.S. negotiated first the WTO and then China's accession to the WTO. And then Mexico had to compete with China in the U.S. market, and of course lost an enormous share of its exports here to China, and had to compete with a country that not only had lower wages, but also in the U.S. market, but also had a real industrial policy, spent way more on research and development, and controlled its banking system. The Mexican banking system now 70% owned by foreigners. So all of these things added up, I think, to a weakness that has persisted and doesn't really look good going forward. The Fed is now raising interest rates, and this is a dangerous thing for the whole region because, as many of you may know, almost all the recessions, since all the recessions except the last two since the post-World War II period, have been triggered by the Fed raising interest rates, but it also brings capital out of Latin America. And in 2013, Mexico was hit pretty hard, only grew, I think, about 1.4% after the Fed just even started its tapering of the quantitative easing. So we don't know what that effect is going to be. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why the central bank has 7% interest rates in Mexico right now, which is undoubtedly slowing the economy. So again, this kind of, and by the way, I'm not against trade. I think, countries can really benefit from trade. If this were just about trade, you wouldn't hear any complaints from me. Although, I mean, the tariff, the subsidized corn flooding into Mexico was a very bad thing. About 5 million people were displaced from agriculture, and on net it was about 2 million because a lot of them got jobs in the export agriculture, and that was very serious. And that, by the way, drove a lot of emigration to the U.S. from 1994 to 2000. Emigration to the U.S. from Mexico increased by about 79%. So that was a lot of it. Was what happened to people in rural areas. But again, in terms of trade, what we're really talking about is a whole model that has really, I mean, it's failed in all of Latin America, to tell you the truth. If you look at what happened in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, when these reforms were being implemented, it was terrible. That's why you got all those left governments elected in Latin America after 1998, and Argentina and Brazil and Venezuela and Bolivia and Uruguay and Paraguay and Nicaragua and El Salvador. It was because you had the worst long-term economic failure in Latin America in probably a whole century. So just as measured again by the growth of income per person for 20 years. So I think that what NAFTA has done, it's part of something that has really locked Mexico into a failed model, and at least from the point of view of the majority of people. That's not to say that some people haven't gotten very rich. It's just from the point of view of the majority of people, it's been a pretty bad deal. And maybe I should leave it there.
Thank you, Mark. Extraordinarily important, I think, to put those opinions on the table. One point that I will disagree with you is that you won't find people who will defend NAFTA. I think, as Gerardo said, in Mexico there's a lot of folks across the political spectrum.
I didn't exactly say that. I said I'd like to hear somebody say that NAFTA has actually been good for Mexico, for the majority of Mexican people in the last 23 years. Okay?
It's interesting because Andrés Manuel López Obrador recently said, a couple of months ago, he says, on balance, NAFTA has been good for Mexico. He said, it doesn't mean it can't be improved.
He's running for president. He has to say that.
He's what, sorry?
He's running for president, so he has to say something like that. I mean, I know him. I know what he thinks.
Well, we'll hear from our good friend Mario Delgado later on, who will talk about what the Morena party should or should not be saying.
But anyway, I'm sure he didn't offer any statistics to support that point of view.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
No, but he would certainly agree with you on the point on Mexican agriculture, and I think it's a very important point. You know, and nobody would dispute, I think, that the fact that all these people got essentially pushed off their land, it has been a violent and ugly transformation for many people in Mexico. And unfortunately, measures have not been taken by the Mexican government. Sufficient measures haven't been taken by the Mexican government to compensate and to help those people adjust. I would say that Mexicans have a greater access to consumer goods today than they had 25 years ago. And I'd also say that Mexico seems to have escaped the boom and bust cycle that seemed to be inherent under the old political system and under ISI. And certainly the formation or the structure of the Mexican economy is radically different from 60% of GDP in the hydrocarbon sector back in the 1980s to now oil and gas accounting for less than 7% of overall GDP. That's an amazing transformation, I think, in Mexico. But certainly your point on China's accession to the WTO, a hugely disruptive event for everybody, it seems. Well, Antonio Ortiz Mena will know this better than me, but Mexico fought tooth and nail to get as many concessions out of China as possible. Basically, Mexico was the last holdout for the WTO for China's accession, and got a 15-year a period where Mexico could adjust to the accession. Unfortunately, that wasn't really effective in the end for many industries. We have a few minutes. Alvaro, we are wherever Alvaro is. He's disappeared again. We're supposed to end in about 3 minutes. I'm going to extend this panel for another 7 minutes. I'd like to put on the table this question for the panelists, and that is, if there's one thing that you would fix about NAFTA in order to make it a either more equitable or more effective agreement, what would it be? Begin here, Laura.
Start with the girl. I think bringing in some of the points that Simon and Duncan both made, it does need to be a more inclusive agreement. I accept that it has been the large companies that initially promoted free trade agreements, and they saw that their interests were necessarily served by integrating markets and reducing border frictions and creating efficiencies. And there was a promise that the next step would be a more inclusive agenda that would help small and medium-sized enterprises, would work more on the transitional issues. I mean, my guy who lost the job in the jug wine industry, he did not then turn around and learn C++ programming and start working for BlackBerry. So those transitions haven't been adequately addressed. I disagree with Donald Trump's prescriptions for how to fix global trade, but I agree that he has hit a nerve, that there are many, many people that feel excluded from international trade agreements, and we collectively have to do better.
Simon.
I can't come up with one thing, but I'll say three things quickly. The first is on Mark's point about the subsidized corn. What I would say is, well, maybe that tells us that NAFTA wasn't neoliberal enough. We need to address these subsidies. We need rules getting rid of these subsidies. Second thing is, as I mentioned earlier, I think that the lack of institutional support, the lack of a secretariat is what led NAFTA to become out of date, and I really think it would be important, and I know it's not going to happen, but to have some more institutions supporting it. And then third, just to say, we all agree that NAFTA should be modernized, so let's just get in the e-commerce provisions and cover more services now that we know how to include services in trade agreements. Do the modernization that we were already doing with the TPP, and we all agree should be done with the NAFTA. So those are my one things that
said very quickly. Yes. Well done.
Quickly.
Gerardo.
What I would include is something on labor movement, something that was left out from the original agreement. And I think the reasons to promote labor between Mexico and the U.S. Particularly, it's still there. I mean, the wage gap's still there. Mexicans want to come to the U.S. to work, and the U.S. Benefits from Mexican labor in certain areas. And I think there is a need for to regulate this flow of workers that come with documents and legally, and that can come and go back to Mexico in an orderly way. And I think this is something that should be addressed and included in the future discussion. I participated in a forum with some people that is also here probably, with the Center for Economic, I don't remember, with Michael Clemens, that we prepare a draft on these issues and how to manage and deal with this. And I think that's something that should be included. Of course, it's not going to be included, but it's something that I would include. Rufus.
I think, well, I would certainly agree with some of the stuff that Laura and my colleague here said that about certainly improving. I think TPP was a great step forward, both from the standpoint of addressing the kind of new economy that really didn't exist when NAFTA was first negotiated, but also a great opportunity where, you know, business was supporting much better labor standards and the adherence by both governments and business to a better way of redressing the imbalance between labor and capital that others have talked about. And I think, you know, it's a shame it didn't happen in the TPP context, but I think there is an opportunity in NAFTA. I think that opportunity will be lost if, as Laura pointed out, the Trump administration is focused on building in new forms of protection. It's hard for me to see how those tightening of restrictions on trade are really going to help Mexico. You know, if the concern of some of my colleagues here is to see Mexico advance, first of all, I have fundamental disagreements with what Mark has, the kind of history he has recounted, for example, of Latin America. This is really a novel way of thinking that, you know, the reason for all the closed market autocracy in Latin America was a reaction to the liberalism of the 80s, and that all those experiments in Argentina and Venezuela and other countries have been great for those countries. When the reality is, the winners in Latin America over the last 30 years have been countries which embraced their integration into the global economy, whether you look at Chile or Colombia or Costa Rica. And in fact, now Argentina is realizing this. It's also very hard for me to see. I mean, I don't like Americans telling Mexicans what's good for them, first of all. I think Mexico, as a sovereign nation with a better form of democracy than it had when NAFTA was first contemplated, largely because of people who saw the need for a fundamental transition to what my colleague called a neoliberal order, as if that's something that's really been bad for people all around the world, living through the greatest era of prosperity in world history, and we're deciding that that's bad for us. But I certainly think that Mexico today has to take into account in these negotiations exactly what are in its best interests of its people and decide that for itself at the negotiating table.
Mark, can NAFTA be fixed to make it a better treaty, or should we just ditch it?
Do you want me to answer any of that?
You have the last word, my friend. It's up to you.
Okay, well, I think I
First
should.
of all, I was responding to things you said, so.
Well, you were responding to some things that I didn't say, so maybe I should at least say that, okay? I didn't say anything
But you
about...
do have 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay, well, just to say, I mean, I didn't say anything at all about the performance of various individual economies since the left governments were elected. But if you want me to, I certainly could. I mean, poverty was reduced in Latin America from 2000 to 2013 from 44 to 28% after growing actually for 20 years.
Yeah, almost entirely because of Brazil and Mexico and because of their growth of trade.
Actually, no, it was not.
It was not, certainly not.
It wasn't
not Argentina.
I just gave you the statistics. Okay, Mexico's poverty rate is the same as it was 20 years ago. So it wasn't Mexico at all. If you take Mexico out, I made that comparison. It was 5 times as much poverty reduction, or 4 times as much in the rest of Latin America as there was in Mexico. So that's absolutely not
Well,
true.
I-
And
we
by the way,
fundamentally disagree on the
Brazil,
numbers.
well, no, we don't, because those are the numbers. They're the only numbers.
No, they aren't the only.
And the same is true for all the numbers I gave. These are the official numbers from, I mean, these are the numbers used by the IMF and the World Bank and everybody else. So there's really no disagreement about these numbers. Nobody's challenged them.
What about NAFTA, Mark? Because we've
Well,
really got to wrap up.
if
because
I
the
had to
next
pick
panelists
one,
are here.
if I had to pick one or two things, I would say the investor to state dispute settlement mechanism, because that's something that's just shouldn't even be in any agreement. I mean, the WTO doesn't even have that. You know, you have to have the government has to file a complaint. So giving corporations the right to sue government for anything that infringes on their profit making ability is just something that it's a threat to our entire way of our constitution, our you know, all of our health and environmental regulations. That just shouldn't even ever be there. And the intellectual property protections, of course, too. This is just pure protectionism and a very costly form of protectionism. It costs a lot more than tariffs on steel or orange juice or you know, you're talking about efficiency losses in the thousands of percent, not in 20 or 30. So those two things should go.
Thank you, Mark. Panelists, it was terrific. I really enjoyed the conversation. Great presentations. And I think we've set up perfect for today. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Yeah.
That's all right. Oh, you want to do Q&A? We got time? Oh, we have time for Q&A. So the premature applause. Ted Alden.
Thanks very much. Actually, I have a question for Gerardo on your very interesting charts on the. Sorry, I'm Ted Alden from the Council on Foreign Relations. On the capital labor distribution, your charts seem to show for overall and then for a number of the auto parts industries a big shift in the mid 2000s. In the final assembly industries, it seems more consistent. What's the explanation? I mean, what's the best explanation for why the capital share of value added rose so sharply in the 2000s and the labor share fell? I mean, if you go back to the 90s, do you see the same divergence? I mean, how much does this have to do with NAFTA or with other things that began happening in the 2000s? Thank you.
Shall I respond? Well, if you look at the whole economy, that's something that has been happening since the 1980s, actually, with the opening of the economy. So that has been declining from like for labor, it rose at some point to 42% of total GDP, and it's now 27% of GDP, the value added that goes to labor in the overall economy. So this is something that has been going on. I mean, these figures that I show, unfortunately, INEGI has just started to compile those, and it has very short dimension, specifically for what they call the global manufacturing services in Mexico. So so that's the ones. Those are the ones I show. But this is an overall trend in Mexico, and in other parts of the world as well, of course.
Thank you, Gerardo. Guillermo.
Hi, my name is Guillermo Garcia from Texas A&M School of Law. My question has to do with the culturalization of NAFTA and the current situation that we're going in the United States right now with all the racial tensions that are happening. I wonder if you have any views on whether the anti-NAFTA sentiment is also being provoked by the racial tensions in the United States, the cultural wars. And I'm just to give you a few examples. I was born in 1982. When I was in Mexico in our public education school books, it was part of our history to learn about NAFTA. We all knew about NAFTA. We were indoctrinated to believe that Mexico and the US were here together to be a united region, and we're moving towards integration as was happening in Europe. I don't feel that in the United States there was a culturalization of NAFTA to that strength, and many of the new generations, they don't see the value, they don't see the interest. There's a lot of tensions of what to blame on Mexicans, and Mexicans being, this perception of taking the jobs. I don't see the same narrative against the Canadians. So I was wondering if we don't fix this element, and it has to do with the institutions you were talking about, of culturalization and making it more stable in the long run, we're not going to be able to fix this in the next 20 years. We're going to keep having these tensions about the Mexico and the US relationship.
Thank you, Guillermo. Antonio, do you want to ask a question? Then I've got one over here as well. We'll take three together. Just a point on that. In Mexicans' primary and high school textbooks, the United States used to be identified as the enemy and is now identified as the partner. And that's a very important thing. Whether that's brainwashing or culturalization, you decide.
And if you look at the numbers of Mexican perception of the U.S. before Trump, the Mexicans perceived the U.S. as a friendly neighbor.
Absolutely.
After Trump, that's when you see it started.
Antonio.
Yes, hello. I am Antonio Ortiz Mena from Albright Stonebridge Group. I have a question for Gerardo. Sorry, but everyone's talking to Gerardo. First of all, would you say Mexico's better off with or without NAFTA in hindsight? You know, a bit to address Mark's question. We are where we are. NAFTA is what it is. Would you rather we had not have NAFTA, or it's better than we had it and we are where we are? And secondly, some issues about the Mexican economy were mentioned by you and by Mark. To what extent do you think NAFTA is partly to blame for those challenges, or to what extent do you think it's just part of a solution? Thank you.
I'm Bethany Allen Ibrahimi, I'm a journalist at Foreign Policy magazine. So the Trump administration's threats to pull out of NAFTA have alarmed our allies, but it's also, as you mentioned, jump-started this maybe very belated trade discussion, national discussion that we're having. On which side does the balance fall? I mean, if you could wave your wand and, you know, change the outcome of the election, would you? Do you think it's worth it, the price that the country is paying to be able to have this discussion?
Thank you very much. And we're going to bend the rules and have one last question here. Thank you.
Jack Apperl with Inside U.S. Trade. Kind of a fundamental question, and for those who see NAFTA as being a boon for all three countries, it would appear that Mexico and Canada have the most to lose, regardless of whether all three countries would lose. And this is kind of a unique discussion to have because you can see how NAFTA has played out for the past over 2 decades, and make a decision about how to go forward. And my question is, based on the fact that Mexico and Canada have more to lose, why does that not show through more in the negotiations, right? So each country has a red line, but is it, worse for Canada and Mexico to ditch the agreement on a whole versus agree to some of the more protectionist proposals that the U.S. is making, right? Why is it not in their best interest to bite the bullet, say dispute settlement, for example, won't be binding, and go on with the rest of the agreement and salvage what they can?
Thank you, Jack. Let's begin from my left to on the right over here. Mark, would you like to respond to any of those questions?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think just to provide some balance, everybody's been referring to the opposition to NAFTA in terms of Trump. And, there was a guy named Bernie Sanders who got 46% of the vote in the Democratic primary and actually forced, more than Trump did, Hillary Clinton to take a position against the TPP. And I think that's the kind of opposition that I think is productive, because if he were president or somebody adopting those views, they would renegotiate NAFTA to make it better and not worse. And so that's the kind of thing that I think we should be looking at. How does it how could we fix this so if it's possible? I don't think it's obviously not going to happen under Trump, but so that you don't have these terrible provisions which redistribute income upward, which make it more difficult to governments to not engage in the engage in the protectionism that make it harder for governments to protect public health and safety and everything else that's built into it. These are the kind of things that really have to be eliminated, or the agreement would have to go. That's how I see it.
Rufus.
Well, as a former U.S. negotiator, but also somebody representing U.S. business, I'm going to be very careful not to try to convince Mexicans or Canadians what's in their self-interest. In my opinion, they're both democratic states, sovereign governments. They can decide at the negotiating table what they will and won't accept in in a negotiation with Donald Trump. I don't, I would be very surprised if they take their lead from people in Washington about what's in their national self-interest. I do know that from U.S. businesses' point of view, let's be realistic about what is happening here. This is not a decision by Canada or Mexico to re-examine trade agreements, go back towards pre-existing structures, move away towards what maybe one person thinks is an improved NAFTA and somebody else thinks is really a more restrictive arrangement. Regardless of what the U.S. does, whether it pulls out of NAFTA, whether it pulls out of KORUS, whether it pulls out of other trade agreements, Mexico, which already has something like 40 free trade agreements in the world, Canada, I don't know how many Canada has, they're both not only going forward with others, but deepening the ones they have. They're looking at ways of diversifying their sources of supply from a potentially unreliable partner that has reneged on previous commitments. And they're thinking very hard about how they would survive in a post-NAFTA environment. I have no doubt, that they're going to continue to go down that route. Now, the question is from a U.S. perspective, what does all this isolation from the rest of the world by essentially fundamentally re-examining and revisiting trade agreements? If there's things you can negotiate at the table that actually do strengthen, both the social conditions and the wealth distribution, everything else, many of which are as a result of both technology and domestic policy decisions, I'm all in favor of them. I've been pushing hard on the business community to, for example, not only continue to embrace open trade, but also to embrace new policies in workforce redevelopment, education, and infrastructure, because I think the interesting thing is that this global drive for greater integration, which is going to continue, and which Donald Trump isn't going to change, and nothing the U.S. decides to do will change the direction the world's going. It is going to force governments to address a lot of other social and economic justice issues. And I think that's, in the long run, a good thing. And I think it's to go to the question the woman from the Policy magazine had, I think that's part of this debate, not attributing to Mexico or trade agreements things which are really happening overall in the global economy. Anyway, that's why I made the point about Mexico representing 6% of our economy and our trade deficit with Mexico representing less than 0.2%. That is not what has driven the wage stagnation or the changes in the realities of industrial manufacturing and manufacturing labor in the United States. Just take one little chart that I'd like to show people. What has happened to manufacturing employment as a percent of total employment in the industrialized world since 1950? It's gone from 33% to 9%. It didn't drop off a cliff when we started negotiating free trade agreements or when we negotiated the WTO. It's been a steady, consistent trend over the past 70 years. And at the same time, manufacturing output has increased. Now, this shows you that the basic composition of employment and the nature of work is changing, and we aren't doing enough with our tax policies, our general economic policies, our social safety net, and other things to really address those realities which are going to exist no matter what we do with NAFTA.
Thank you. Gerardo, you had a couple of questions?
Yes, responding to Antonio's specific question, I think Mexico is better off with NAFTA than without NAFTA. And I think most of the Mexicans are better off, at least as consumers. I think the problem with NAFTA is, there are two problems with NAFTA. One is that the benefits have been much smaller than promised. And secondly, that those benefits are very unequally distributed. And by that, I mean by sectors, by regions, and by people in general. So if you go to this to the central part of Mexico, to some parts of the North Mexico, they are much better off than they used to be because of NAFTA and foreign direct investment and trade and so on and so forth. If you go to the southern part of Mexico, people doesn't feel that they have benefit at all. So I think the problem with NAFTA is precisely that. But I don't think that's necessarily attributed to NAFTA. I would say that most of those problems have to do with the lack of domestic policies that, if they have been implemented and improved in the past 2 decades, we could be much better off. And just to finish with this, for the future, I think we are much better off with no agreement, if that's your question more towards the future, with no agreement than with a bad agreement. Although I expect to keep NAFTA at least as it is. I mean, at least, because there is a risk, I think, that given the tone of the negotiations, we could end up with a much worse agreement for Mexico than the one we currently have.
Simon.
I want to address the point about how much of this NAFTA criticism is really sort of ethnic fears, ethnic hatred. And I think it's substantial, but I don't know how to measure it. You know, I don't know how you do these surveys. So all I have are anecdotes, and you know, I read these stories, and sometimes it's about China, sometimes it's about Mexico. There was an article in the Washington Post a few weeks ago about Senator Bob Casey visiting some union workers in Pennsylvania, and he's talking to them, and you know, one of them describes this imported Chinese steel using an ethnic slur, and Bob Casey afterwards says, "Well, maybe I should have said something to him." Yes, we all need to say something to it, but I mean, this is beyond trade, though. This is just a larger problem right now, and I wish I had better answers as to what we're supposed to do about it all. But I think that's important here. Hard to measure, but we need to acknowledge it. We need to talk about it.
There's some interesting data from the Chicago Council they just released, which breaks it down according to, you know, the traditional party structure and then core Trump supporters. Yeah. And when you look at the opinions that are shared amongst core Trump supporters on some of these issues, it's very interesting. The disjuncture between them and the rest is much greater than within the others on pretty much every issue. And that gives you an idea. Laura was going to respond, but she said that the moderation was so terrible she had to leave the panel. So I will actually, yes, sorry, is this a question?
My name's Dee. I'm actually alumni of this school.
Can I just hold you 1 second? Are the organizers cool with this? Because, I mean, what you could do is you could grab them afterwards, if that's okay with you.
No,
we're way out of time.
30 seconds. We shouldn't listen to one word President Trump says. We shouldn't listen to one word Bernie Sanders says or Hillary Clinton says. They were running for the presidency of the United States of America. They were running. That's why they were saying the words that they were saying. They wanted to win. They wanted to win. They don't really care or understand that much about complicated trade law. They wanted to win.
Thank you. I think that before President Trump came into office, most of us would have agreed with that. It turns out that he does seem to believe the things he said on the campaign trail, which is weird for a politician. But anyway, thank you very much. Thanks to the panel.